Today we're continuing our journey of painting rocks. So this is part 2 of painting rocks 2 ways, and this session is actually painting them. But a little thing to touch on with drawing to assist with rocks is to see them as a 3-dimensional rectangle or square. So I picked this photo because it's quite clear where the side plane of the rock is, the top plane, the end. So I'll show you that in just a quick drawing or sketch for the moment. So if you find when you draw your rocks they seem one-dimensional, this is a really good way to think of it. So with this first rock, the large long one, I would think of that first as a 3-dimensional box where I'm seeing one end of the box, the side plane, and the top of the rectangle. And so I would draw, let's draw all 3 of these big rocks. So we've got an end, and so not looking at the rock shape, and sorry, that's where I just was thrown then because we're seeing a different end here. So thinking again with this next one, we've got the side plane, the top, and we are seeing this end. So for perspective you wouldn't have 2 buildings drawn like this, but for the purpose of our rocks we're going to do them this way. And we have another large one here, and we can see the side plane, it goes right off the page. It's the side plane, and we don't actually see an end on this rock because it goes off the page. So we've got the top and the side, and on these 2 we've got the side, the top, and one end each. So starting with the rectangle, then you can start to think about, okay, well, what's the actual shape of the rock? And here's the side plane, it comes down, it gets narrower here. The top plane of the rock, it's rounded at the end, and it comes fairly straight across, and then it angles down and meets up here. It's horizontal because it's in the water. And we've got the end plane that's in shadow, and it just kind of is rounded. So if I shade this to show you better, the side plane here is in shadow. And so now we have a little bit more of a rock 3-dimensional. The same with this one here, we've got the side plane is quite narrow and low. It's rounded at the end. And this comes up and then goes down a little bit. The end's got some detail and other lumpy bits here, but we still would see that as the end plane. And then the top of this, even though the rock is pointed, this whole top area is the top plane. And if we were seeing over it, we'd see over to the other side is still part of that top plane. It just happens that it comes to a point and then it comes down here. So again, we've got shadow on the side and shadow on the end, mostly because it's tucked in, the light's not getting into here. The light source for this is fairly much from above. And this rock I didn't draw it yet. So the side plane curves down and sort of around a little bit. So this is in shadow. And then the top of this rock goes up and off the page. So if you think about the 3 planes or 2 planes that you can see of the rocks in your photos when you're drawing them, you'll get a more dimensional shape to your drawing than if you just draw the rock like this. And this is clearer when I paint exactly where I want to put the shadows. So I don't draw that initial rectangle, but I do think of it like this as I draw, and I might just put the top. So I'm drawing the actual rock shape, not the rectangle, but I'm thinking of it as each plane and direction. So like most of my paintings, if you've worked with me much before, you'd know I do a lot of underwash work, and that's really important to me. So first I'm looking for what colours and tones I can see under the shadows, and these rocks are fairly sandstony coloured, so a variety of yellows and ochre colours will help to get a little bit of colour. I don't necessarily want to fully fill the whole grain of the paper. I'm happy to leave some little spots of white dry paper showing. The yellow is a little bit stronger in this shadow, so I'm going to pop a little bit more there. This is yellow ochre now with Naples as the first colour. And when we talked before about, in other videos, sorry, about shine and reflection, I'm just pushing that back a little bit because I can see I actually want to put some cerulean blue just here where I can see it in the photo. It will add interest to my rocks. I'm not worried about them bleeding together. I actually want to be always conscious in an underwash not to have lots of dry lines against dry lines. So doing these in big shapes works fine. I can also see some lovely cool areas in that this rock here, so I am going to drop a little bit more cerulean there and perhaps across the top. There's no point putting the cerulean where I've already put yellow. Like, I've got to watch that that doesn't become green. So like over here I tried to push the yellow away a little bit before I put the blue in. Here it's going to have shadow over it, so it's not as much of concern. And you can see I'm working quite wet. Some stronger yellow again in this part that's going to have the shadow. And I adjusted this rock's positioning here because it's a little bit of a compositional problem the way they line up straight away. It's a tangent. I was trying to think of the word then. It almost creates a tangent where the lines look to line up and it's hard for your eye to spot which element is in front of which. I'm just adding a little touch of light red maybe into the bottom of this one. I might put a few bits here and there. And now I've got to let that dry because it's quite a cold day here as well. It's going to take a little bit longer, so I will come back to that when it's dry. So I'm starting back with this rock here, and I'm mixing up a mix for my shadow colours with Ultramarine blue and Alizarin crimson. And I always have a little test piece of paper handy to test. So when you're making up a shadow colour, you don't want a real red violet because that won't read like shadow. It does need to be a mauve, a blue mauve, so more blue than pink. So I'll test and make sure I've got my colour. So I'm starting back with this rock here in the front, and I'm going to start to just look for the shadow shapes. I've mixed up a mauve with Ultramarine blue and Alizarin crimson, and I want to just pop that in onto my shadowed plane of my rock. Now I'm really careful not to just fill that whole shape with purple. I want to have some little bits where it might suggest that the rock juts out and catches the light, so I leave those without the mauve. And here it gets in, but I don't want it too busy. Like at the moment that actually looks too busy, so I'll fill a little bit more. Got a little crack coming up here, and there's a little bit of shadow on the top. I feel like my mauve is a little bit too pinky, so I'm going to just add some blue, to it. And what I nearly always do with a shadow, once I've popped it on, is add some of the local colour. So for instance, this rock is sandstony, yellow coloured. So to make this shadow look authentic, and also to have it glow a little bit, I will add a little touch of yellow back into it. So I'm picking up the yellow ochre. And while yellow is the complement of purple and will grey it, there's just something that happens when you drop yellow into mauve on your painting that actually makes it glow rather than making it grey. I think still I've got too many of these little gaps. And remember, this part we said was shiny and blue, but it actually blends into the shadow, so I'm going to add some more of that blue on the surface there, and then a little bit more of this rock colour up around the edge of that, where I've just taken that shadow, because it's more that it's actual local colour than shadow there. The rock's not smooth. And you can see in some places I'm cleaning my brush, coming back and just softening the edges. I might put a colour down, but I might not want it to be hard edged on both sides. So here I put some yellow, I cleaned my brush, I took the moisture off on the paper towel that's next to me, and then I softened the edge. Now I'm coming in with a darker mix of ultra blue and brown matter. A lot of people would use burnt sienna, so if you've got burnt sienna instead of brown matter, that's fine. I like the rich redness of the brown matter. And I just didn't shape this rock very well at the back, so I'm adding a little bit of shape to it. I'm dropping a little bit of this dark while the mauve's still wet in along the waterline. And you know, there's actually a darker edge to the shape just up the top here, where the top of the shadow is, where it changes plane. So I'll let that dry a little bit here, and I'll come into this rock next to it. And again, I go back to the mauve mix. And so there's a variety of shapes over here. And like before, actually for this one, I'm going to add some light red. So light red by Windsor Newton sits so beautifully in that shadow colour that I mixed up. I might add a little bit here as well. I do this combination a lot when I do gum trees, so I'll put the shadow colour on of the mauve and then the light red dropped here and there into that, just like it makes the colour sing. Now each time I come back I've got thicker pigment on my brush because I want it to not spread as far. So I'm looking for where I can see changes and just dropping in that dark mix. And now when I drew this rock, I don't know why I drew the shape right down here of the side, but it actually is very high and deep. So usually I would let that dry so that this keeps its shape. But because that's shadow against shadow, it actually doesn't matter. I'll just soften. So I'm going to come in now with the mauve, similar to what I've been doing. And I'm going to do this a little bit more dry brush because this rock is a little bit more textured. So I want to keep some areas like this because it's a big shape. I'm happy if I get a little bit of texture happening. And I might even just come back with the yellow ochre and fill some of it, not put mauve everywhere. So I can either put the two colours next to each other or I can drop one into the other, and it will still give me the look of a shadow because the tone is darker than the highlight. So this, I can see actually these colours travel up and over onto the top in some places. You know, my rock wouldn't have this really straight square line, so I want to do that before, suggest that before this actually dries. And there's actual nearly black kind of staining or marks on this rock, so I'll come back and do that towards the end with a dry brush. For now, I'm just trying to settle in the depth of the main part of the shadow. So this is the dark mix of ultra blue and brown matter. This has got to be darker than this because it sits behind, but I can also see there's that that dark shape that's going to come down in my later work, so that will work to separate those two. Might just put a little touch of mauve up in the top there. But what I might do is try and get just a sort of bluey grey colour happening through part of this, where those colours are going to, where those real darks are going to come down. Before this dries, I just want to soften that edge a little bit. It's just a little bit too much of a hard line, and here some of these areas where it travels up onto the top, I want to suggest there's shape and something else happening. So you can see at the moment it looks like a colourful rainbow, and you might be tempted to ditch your work and start again, which is what I was just actually thinking about. But I know the magic of watercolour and I know to bear with it, so I'm going to let that dry. And you know, my preference is not to blow dry it. If I'm really desperate, I would hit it with a hairdryer, but I would rather all of these colours have the time to settle into the paper as they do naturally. If I touch the blow dryer to it, I change how the pigments settle into the paper and how they mingle and which ones granulate. You know, I just am adjusting that too much by blow drying. Just a quick little stage left to finish these rocks off. And I mentioned earlier I was tempted to ditch it and start again. It was looking a bit like a rainbow, but I just want to show you this layer once it's dried. this is where I say you've just got to trust the magic of the watercolor, because you know, it looked like this crazy wash when I was doing that shadow shape, but now it just has this gorgeous glow of color through the mauve and through the shadow. And I don't think I showed this one. I had intended to at the start, to just say this is generally how I aim for the multiple colors within that shadow. So you can see reds, yellows, and a variety of color. These rocks were painted just sitting in the front of my car, doing a little study when I had some time one day near the beach, and the sunlight obviously was backlit or quite high in the sky for this full shadow on the front plane of the rocks, but similar-ish to what I'm doing here in style. So all I need to do now is add in these really dark. So I think I mentioned earlier in the video I was tempted to start again on this. I felt like I had this crazy rainbow looking wash happening, but I also said trust the magic of the watercolor, and so I know to do that. And now I love how this looks when it's dry. It has this glow of yellow through the mauve. And as an example, I had meant to show you this old painting that I did just in the front of my car one day, leaning on the steering wheel at Southwest Rocks when I had some time. And the sun is fairly similar here. It's quite high in the sky or backlit for the rocks to be really shadowed. But you can see what I'm aiming for, this glow of yellow. In some areas it's cooler blue, the light red coming through the shadows, and it just makes for really interesting shadow passages rather than a shadow that is mauve or just darker than excuse me, darker than the color of the item, like the rock, or whether it's a flower, whatever it is that you're painting. So now I'm just coming in with more of a dry brush technique. I've got less moisture in my brush, and I'm just scooting the brush around in the areas that I can see this staining. And I've actually gone to Van Dyke Brown instead of more of a darker, blacker color like it is in the photo. I can add a touch of blue in order to darken it. I'm just mixing up my normal dark mix of brown matter and ultramarine blue, and I'm adding that into the Van Dyke Brown. And because I was mixing colour just then, I've got more water in my brush unintentionally. So I'm putting this colour on, and then I'm going to clean my brush, and you'll see I'll come back and soften it in some areas. So I fully clean the pigment out of the brush. You can hear it touching the bottom of my water well often in the video. And now just in some areas I'll come up next to the colour that I want to soften, just up against one side here and there. Let that bleed down. I don't want to soften it all, like I want to keep that dry brush work in places. But in other areas I want lost and found edges. I'm going to pick up just a slightly lighter colour. This is just more of a mauve, a dark mauve that I make with ultramarine blue and brown matter. And I am softening that here and there with the dancing brush, because I want that just to indicate various divots and changes in the rock plane. So this was just a little bit of yellow ochre, but it was too bright for what I intended there. I want to reinforce the dark right down at the water level. But again, I'll soften just next to it in some places so that it's not hard edges all the way around. There's a lovely crack appearing here. And so the bottom side of the crack where it's sitting in behind will be a hard edge, but I'll soften the top plane, the top edge of the shape, so that it's more realistic. That means this sits forward and that bit behind sits back. And now on this rock, there's less of that dark than the one behind, but there's some little suggestions of it. So I'm going to put the dark on sparingly and then come back and soften again. Cleaning the brush, you can hear that hit the bottom of the water well. To fully clean the water out, fully clean the paint out, I'm not just dipping it and then putting a wet black pigment back on. I actually want to soften with clean water. And again, with a slightly lighter mix, I'm just going to put a little bit of texture on the top of this rock, but I don't want it hard like that was when I put it down. So a bit of clean water just to move the colour around and soften. This shadow shape here isn't as hard edged at the top, it kind of wrapped over, so I'll add a little bit. And then I didn't do anything on this rock at all behind here, but I won't do that for the sake of keeping the video length down. And it's important down the bottom at the level of the water to have a little bit darker. To sit those rocks into the water. This one again is a bit too light all over the top, so that my rock study looks a little bit more interesting. I'll just put a little touch of water. It's quite turquoisey in this water around South Australia. And often what happens is we can see the rocks underwater, so it's important to let some of that, rather than bleed the blue up like I just did, I would normally bleed the dark down. So ignore what I did then, and what I would usually do is just bring some of that dark down, because if the water's shallow and these rocks are sort of close to us in the shallows, they'll look more grounded into the water if we just can see a little bit of that dark reflection. And then our water can get a little bit greener and shallower as it comes closer.